so much for joining me on Cranford Radio. Today, I am joined by Hal Brown. Now, you may not recognize that name, but we are actually revisiting a topic that we had done back in January of 2022 on the Cranford Radio podcast. Back then, I interviewed an author by the name of Luke Jared Kummer. He wrote a book, I guess you would call it a historical fiction, called Taker's Mad, about a murder that did not take place in Cranford, but had a strong Cranford connection. Hal is also an author, and he takes a more non-fictional look at this particular murder. That's maybe the best way to put it. Hal, welcome to Cranford Radio.
Thank you for having me, Bernie.
Well, I gave people just a little bit of a glimmer of what this is about, but for those who are totally unfamiliar with this particular case, could you give us a little bit of an overview of this murder and how it ties into Cranford, please?
Sure. On April 23rd, 1891, a destitute woman named Carrie Brown, who was born Ellen Carolyn Montgomery, entered the East River Hotel with a man. And within a few hours, she was murdered, and her body was found on the 24th at approximately 10 o'clock. A man named Amir Ben Ali was convicted of the murder and sent to prison, originally to Sing Sing and then to Auburn. Then he made his way to Matawan and then to Dannemora. 10 years, Ali had the support of the French consulate, a lawyer named Ovid Robillard from Pine Street in New York, and they had 4 unsuccessful pardon campaigns. In 1901, a man from Cranford, New Jersey, lived right over there on Madison Avenue, George Granville Damon, entered the scene. Mr. Damon was a senior partner in a printer firm of George Damon and Sons, and he was survived by a widow, and he had 3 teenage sons at the time. He was born in North Reading, Mass. In 1838, and he had a printing facility on Beekman Street in Lower East Side. Damon came forward with another Cranford resident named John A. Lee, along with an employee of his named Charles Brennan, who worked at Damon and Pete's printing facility. They supplied the New York authorities with 3 affidavits, spearheaded by Damon, of course, that on the morning of the 24th of April, 1891, George Damon had a hired hand, ostensibly, that worked in his land, went to the Lower East Side, came back on the 24th, and left a bloody shirt and a key. And he took off for parts unknown. For 10 years, Damon held on to this. His reticence is unfathomable. Amir Ben Ali was almost electrocuted. He could have been sentenced to first-degree murder. And in any event, in March of 1901, Damon came forward with those 2 men I already mentioned, and they filed these affidavits, and along with a get-out-of-trouble letter from New Jersey Governor Foster Voorhees. This was presented to the district attorney in Manhattan at the time, Eugene Philbin. He kicked it upstairs to Governor Odell, and they went through the motions of filing affidavits. Damon filed 4. Brennan filed 1, and Lee filed 1, and they seem almost scripted. And I would hope that readers of our book will peruse them, and maybe they can come up with their own interpretation. But Damon said that his hired hand, he was afraid of this man, and for the 10 years he stayed on the sidelines. It was this evidence, if you want to call it that, was instrumental in finding Amir Ben Ali released from prison in April of 1902, 11 years to the day that Carrie Brown was murdered in the East River Hotel. As I said, 4 separate pardon campaigns were launched by the French consulate in New York City, and all were unsuccessful because they lacked anything tangible to free Ali. But this evidence, a brass key, and the story about this man that had worked for Damon in Cranford, were instrumental in getting Ali free.
Well, certainly a fascinating story. Let me start off by asking a question. You live in eastern Pennsylvania.
Yes.
Why do you have this fascination with this particular case?
Well, for 20 years, I've been involved in Jack the Ripper research. I used to own a website called jtrforums.com. I had been a poster on Casebook. I've written over 40 articles about the Whitechapel murders, or American Whitechapels, like in Manhattan, Sweeney, Shambles, the Lower East Side, places like that. but my wife is originally from Massachusetts, and she had a lingering interest in Carrie Brown. And one day I sat down and I started thinking about the excuses that George Damon came up with. I just wanted to say to the readers, and I'm not castigating George Damon as a citizen of Cranford. He was very well respected. His obituary showed that. I started to look at it a little deeper, and I was fortunate enough to find a cache of archives that were sent to me by the fine folks in Albany, 451 pages that included files that have never been seen before, 14 affidavits, whereas previously people thought there were maybe 5 or 6 that existed. And I found 4 affidavits from Damon. And what is interesting about this case that really surprised me was the influence of a murderer named James M. Dougherty, who in 1890 had murdered one of the medical doctors at the Flatbush Asylum. He was sent to Sing Sing in 1891. He had a propensity for writing letters. He would write letters to Grover Cleveland. He would write letters to a woman named Mary Anderson, expressing his love for her. And he was a compulsive letter writer. So he's in prison and he meets Ali. They're both sent to Dannemora in 1901. He writes a letter to Governor Odell and he says, listen, this Damon guy is full of it. His story is kaput. Ali is his hired hand. So Odell, not wanting to free a guilty man, has Eugene Philbin, the district attorney in Manhattan at the time, check into this. He checks into the story, gets affidavits from other people, particularly James Jennings. James Jennings was the proprietor of the East River Hotel in 1891. By this time, he was out. He had no part in the hotel. The key was looked at by Jennings, and Jennings filed an affidavit and said, this is not the type of key that was used at the hotel at that time. We used iron keys for the 5th floor. Well, objectively, you could look at that and say, hey, it's been 10 years since the murder. Maybe Jennings made a mistake. But the person who really does the most damage to the affidavits filed by Damon is Damon himself. In 1891, on April 24th, a local prostitute who lived at the hotel, Mary Miniter, she was 21 years old. She'd been living there for 5 years already. She gave the police a description of the man who went into the hotel with Carrie Brown. She would do this on May 13th, and she would do this on June 30th of the same year. She never wavered in her description. The man had a long, sharp nose, heavy blonde mustache, and that he spoke broken English. Well, Damon's hired hand, according to Damon, had a flat nose, no facial hair whatsoever, and he walked with a pronounced hitch in his step, as if he had one leg was shorter than the other. Mary Miniter did not describe any of those characteristics. And it's for this reason that some of us, the very few that study the case, don't buy Damon's story anymore or the affidavits. The big question is now, why would Damon involve himself in a case that, he came up with these 6 excuses why he was reticent, why he would get involved with it? Maybe he was bitten by the pardon bug. I have 150 pages of petitions. This Amir Ben Ali must have been the cause célèbre of the 19th century. There's 150 pages of signed names on these petitions, 4 pardon efforts to get him out. And the only reason they put so much emphasis in getting him out was the French government was defending a French subject. So at this point in time, we could attribute the switch in the narrative to James M. Dougherty, the convicted murderer, because if he had not said anything, if he had not written a letter to Governor Odell would not set the ball in motion to contact D.A. Philbin. Philbin wouldn't have had one of his detectives check out the key story or provide a physical description. Damon had been involved with this pardon effort in 1901 for 100 days before he was asked to give a physical description of his hired hand. That's where we stand right now. That doesn't mean that Ali was innocent or guilty, and it doesn't mean that the man called C. Niccolo, the name that was signed in the register at the East River Hotel, who, by the way, the name was signed in for a man who most of us would consider a murderer anyway, named Tommy Thompson. He was the night manager of the hotel. He wrote that name in. So we don't really know the name of the man that went into the East River Hotel with Carrie Brown. So it's open ended. Whoever killed her, it might be one of those two: C. Nicola or Amir Ben Ali or Thompson himself. Thompson lived 9.5 miles away from the hotel, and on the night in question, April 23rd, he said that he wasn't in the hotel. He had a couple of the hotel employees backed him up. He never has to testify at the trial, as do a couple of other people at mysterious absence.
Well, you raised obviously a very interesting question about why would George Damon get involved with this case in any case. Some of the research that I had done a while back indicated that this farmhand had come to his house in Cranford on Madison Avenue and disappeared mysteriously during the night. And that was the night of the murder. And then reappeared, and they found some objects that raised suspicion. But if under your conjecture that Damon's farmhand, if he did exist, had nothing to do with this, why do you think he would want to file these affidavits and get so involved?
There's two reasons. Number one, I would urge people to read the affidavits. We've included that in our book, East Side Story, from John A. Lee and Charles Brennan, and look at them and look at Damon's affidavits. They weren't filed on the same day, but they look like they were written side by side. They really look scripted. Two reasons why I think that Damon could have been involved. Number one, he got bitten by a pardon bug. He felt sorry for Amir Ben Ali being in prison for 11 years. Maybe he felt Ali was innocent after all, whatever. The second one, Professor George Deacle, who wrote East River Ripper in 2021, an excellent book, by the way, the first book on the case, he conjectured that perhaps it was for business reasons. Maybe he felt that he would get some printing business from these people that he was assisting. We don't know. But for whatever reason that he got involved, his own description of his farmhand negates any resemblance to that man who entered the hotel with Carrie Brown. Ali, on the other hand, a lot of people don't know. They think that he was a victim of some sort of prejudice, class prejudice, whatever. The fact that he had immigrant status. In 1902, an actor, he's probably the most famous thespian in America, stage thespian, William H. Thompson, and it's only found one place. It's in the Buffalo newspaper, Buffalo Courier in 1902. He said that one of the defense's hired interpreters claimed, his name is Emil Sultan, claimed that Ali told him, yes, I was in that room. He didn't say that he murdered her, but he said he was in a room, which would explain the medical evidence of the material under Ali's nails, which was extricated and examined, and it matched what Carrie Brown had eaten earlier in the day on the 23rd. He could have done it. He had a really bad rap sheet for lying. He did himself in. And if you read in our book, we have a chapter devoted to what the jurors thought. And they said he convicted himself, plus with the medical evidence. That doesn't mean he did it. You know, it could have been, as Ali said, he just came into contact with her body. Ali had a propensity of going into rooms after the original client had left, because a lot of times the men would leave the key in the room and then they would leave for parts unknown, leaving the prostitute in the room. Ali would go over and, kick boots with him and get busy with him, and then he would leave them. He had a track record of violence against women. He bit one of the prostitutes who testified against him. So he's an unsavory character. But then again, he may not have been the killer. And for many years, I didn't think he was the killer. I felt that there was some kind of frame up on the part of the New York police. But for Inspector Burns and the NYPD to risk their career over, what if they had found this guy? What if they had found this mysterious man that was with Carrie Brown that night, and he confessed out of the blue, yeah, I did it. Well, that's going to make the NYPD look pretty damn stupid. So, the hunt was on for him. There were a couple leads that petered out, and no one knows to this day who that man was.
You had the Jack the Ripper fascination before you became more involved with this particular case. There was conjecture on the part of some people, particularly the media back in the day, in the early 1900s, or even in the 1890s,
Yeah.
that Jack the Ripper had somehow come across the Atlantic Ocean from London and was now in New York. Do you give any credence to the idea that the person who murdered Carrie Brown was the same person who murdered the prostitutes in London?
Simple answer is no. Carrie Brown didn't have her throat slashed. The victims of the Whitechapel murders did. The newspapers are responsible almost 100% for the idea that Jack the Ripper had come across the Atlantic Ocean. The 1890s were the decade which saw the newspaper wars between William Randolph Hearst, Joseph Pulitzer. That came about a couple years later with the murder of William Goldensuit in 1897. But in the 1890s, the New York Evening World, the Tribune, the Times, they were all very competitive. And these sensational stories sold papers. And that's where most of us that are involved in researching the case think that connection came from.
I want to ask you about a couple of people. First, Carrie Brown. Tell me a little bit about her, who she was, and how she found herself in this situation.
Okay, sadly, we don't know the exact year she was born. At the coroner's inquest, Coroner William Jenkins said that she was 56 years old. This information undoubtedly came from her younger daughter and the undertaker from Salem that came down on April 29th to take her body and bring it back. Coroner Jenkins says she was 56, which would put her at either 1855, 1854. She'd been married very young. She had 3 children. She had a son that died, the second child. Her husband died at sea in 1873 off the coast of Africa. She settled down in Manhattan. She also was in Brooklyn. We have yet to find any addresses that she lived at in Brooklyn. We know she worked for a man named John Flomer, Flomer, in Midtown Manhattan as a servant. She just bounced back and forth between Blackwell's Island and the Lower East Side. She had a tragic life. She could have been a victim of post-traumatic stress disorder. Your husband's away for long periods of time. You're stuck at home. And she took to drink. And her family was down on her for that. So she moved away. She moved to New York, and she spent the remaining years of her life there. She was also said by the Boston Globe in one of the April 1891 newspaper articles that she had been a stage actress. We've yet to find any place that could validate that, but she may have worked, in a theatrical production somewhere. She was able to recite lines from Shakespeare when she was cadging for drinks, and that's where she got the name Shakespeare. A funny thing on the way to research in this case, I found evidence of 2 other women that were named Shakespeare. A woman named Annie Campbell, who they took to the morgue to look at Carrie Brown, and she said, "That's not me." And she was also named Shakespeare. And another woman named Crazy Mary Phillips, who fell out of a window and was impaled on an iron gate, and she was known as Shakespeare. So just like Frenchie, the nickname that Amir Ben Ali was given, several men in the neighborhood had that name or that nickname, and so did women have the name Shakespeare.
Interesting. Ali, after he was released from prison, what happened to him? He was an Algerian, right?
Yes, he was an Algerian. He came to the United States on June 6, 1889 on the Alianca. He bopped around in Brooklyn. He was involved with a theft of a man named George Frank. If you look in the archives, Luke Coomer, who you mentioned already, was the person to digitize the trial transcripts. And the trial is named The People of the State of New York versus George Frank. Now, we found like 8 or 9 aliases for Ali, but they could have been nicknames given to him, misunderstandings by the media. His name was Amer Ben Ali. And he was born in Algeria. He fought in the Franco-Prussian War. In 1901, Governor Odell decides that he's going to pardon him. And April 24th, 1902, he leaves on a lot terrain from the North River, Pier 32, and went back to Algeria, but he with a stopover in France. We don't know if he got out in France and stayed there or back to Algeria. The French consulate had found a job for him in his village. Nobody knows what happened to him, but we're still looking.
Other than George Damon, was there any other Cranford connection that exists with this case?
John A. Lee. If we could find a photo of John A. Lee, who was a local contractor one of those logs in the middle of the road that we ran into was trying to determine how John Lee got involved with this case. There are two John Lees, John A. Lee and John R. Lee. John R. Lee was a well-known contractor out of Patterson. John A. Lee was a less well-known contractor out of Cranford. And for years, we all thought John R. Lee was that man because newspapers in March of 1901 said a well-respected contractor has aligned himself with George Damon. So naturally, we thought it was the Patterson man. It's not. It was John A. Lee. I was stunned when I looked through the affidavits and saw that it was John A. John A. Lee, we don't know where he lived in Cranford at the moment, but he was a neighbor of Damon's, and he supported him in his affidavit. He backed it up. Charles Brennan was an employee. He was a truck man. He died a terrible death in the 1910s. He was crushed on a truck, Damon and Pete's truck, making the delivery. And he signed an affidavit saying that he went to the East River Hotel with George Damon, and they were sitting there having a drink, which is hard to believe. And they noticed a man come downstairs and leave a key on the bar and walk out. So Damon and Brennan stood up, went to the bar. They looked at the key and said, aha, voila, it matches the key that we have. Well, Damon didn't realize that that's all fine and well, but they didn't use that type of key on the fifth floor, according, as I already said, to the previous owner of the hotel, James Jennings. And that's just one of the big glitches in the case.
There was also the fact that Damon's printing company was not terribly far from this East River Hotel where the murder took place, right?
It wasn't, Bernie. It was a mile away at 44 Beekman. And he had been there since 1869. And they had 4 floors. In 1898, they had to get additional quarters. They had to take him at 74 Beekman. So his business wasn't doing badly. He had been a printer since the Civil War.
The nearness of his business to the hotel, has that ever caused you any suspicion that he was somehow involved with the murder?
Yeah, funny you should mention that because, he's the man that has the key. And he's influential enough that he could contact the governor of New Jersey, Foster Voorhees, and get him to sign a get out of trouble card. Damon faced no repercussions for his 10-year reticence to come forward. The only 2 newspapers that we could find were in Buffalo and Washington, D.C. The Washington, D.C. article criticizes him heavily. It's called Perverted Justice, and they suggest that Damon should be subjected to the same 10 years that Amir Ben Ali was in there for. There's just another rumor or, anecdotal history. A woman named Mary Brennan was arrested on April 25th and taken to the Essex Market Police Court. And she told one of the reporters, she said that Carrie Brown was killed to shut her up because she had been blackmailing a local Broadway merchant. And he promised, to take care of her. Carrie Brown told Mary Brennan, also a prostitute, that this man had been giving her $30 a month, which is a lot of money back then. That's $1,000 a month, $1,000 a month. There's possibility there's something to that. In fact, I was working on a fiction book based just on that when you mentioned it. There are very few suspects in the case. You got Amir Ben Ali, this unknown man that entered the hotel with Carrie Brown, C. Niccolo, Damon or someone in Damon's social circle. Tommy Thompson, who in 1886 skewered a man over a nickel in the East River Hotel. And he said the man ran into the sword. He was acquitted. Where most people, if you look at the facts of that case, it would probably have been indicted for first-degree murder. Other than that, it's very limited. And what Nina and I do is we try to find as many loose ends as we can to put them together so people out there become interested in this case. For example, just this year, we found a photo of James M. Dougherty in the mental asylum, Matawan, from the 1890s. And one page up in the book is a photo of Amir Ben Ali that a Danish researcher named Pete Damgaard found. Nina, a month and a half ago, found the first known photograph of the East River Hotel. It was in an archival site in someone's cache of photos, and they had absolutely no idea or clue of what this meant. What it is the first time in 133 years since the murder that anyone has ever seen a hotel. And there were 5 men standing outside. One of them was Herman Yeager. He was the original owner of the hotel, and it was passed down to another guy named Heinrich Steeler. And eventually James Jennings already mentioned, he rented the property and ran it as a flop house. It was a dive. It was notorious. It had several different names: the House of All Drinks, Fourth Ward Hotel, and the East River Hotel. By 1907, the hotel was razed. It was already collapsing.
And this hotel, as you referenced, was not exactly the Marriott or the Waldorf Astoria
Oh,
back
no.
in the day. It was close to the East River, which at the time was still a very active shipping port in New York City.
Absolutely. There are two books, one by a Reverend Alexander Irvine. He wrote it in the early part of the 20th century that I got a hold of. And he describes going into the East River Hotel, and this is after the murder, right after it. He said that the bordellos of Cairo have nothing on this place. Reverend Parkhurst, Samuel Parkhurst, who was instrumental in the 1895 Lexow Committee hearings and the police corruption. Policemen taking bribes, and a lot of them were demoted or they were told to retire, but actually they were booted off the force. The interesting thing that I found in the archives that no one has ever seen, and I was very fortunate, was a affidavit or a letter sent by Inspector Alexander S. Williams, Clubber Williams, the man who named the Tenderloin District the Tenderloin. He was the man that said there's more justice in the end of a nightstick than there is in the whole Supreme Court. He's notorious. Williams sent a letter to Governor Odell. First one was from the Fifth Avenue Hotel in Manhattan, and the second one was from his home in Long Island City, saying, if you want, I have information that will pardon Amir Ben Ali. This is in 1901. If you want it, I have it. And Governor Odell wrote back to him. We have the letters. Said, if you have information that can get this man out of jail, let us know. He also signed the petition in 1897. I found his name on there, Alexander S. Williams. So this was a guy that worked in the NYPD at the time. He actually worked on the case. And he's coming forward now, after Inspector Burns is retired, so it might be a matter of convenience. And he signs the affidavit signs a petition for him saying, yeah, I got information that would free this guy. Why he didn't do it earlier, we don't know.
Well, still a lot of mystery surrounding this case. I've been talking on this episode of Cranford Radio with Hal Brown. He wrote East Side Story, 1891 murder case of Carrie Brown. Hal, thanks so much for sharing your expertise and interest in the case with us.
Thank you very much. It was a pleasure to be here, Bernie.